right, let's talk about Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, which sees Tom Cruise back as Ethan Hunt for the seventh time in this franchise. And this time, Ethan Hunt and his IMF team, they're back to track down a dangerous weapon before it falls into the wrong hands. This isn't a spoiler, it's out there that this weapon that they speak of is some version of artificial intelligence. And given recent news out of Hollywood, there's something extremely surreal about the meta qualities of that. We'll certainly talk about that here as we go. This is a film that I did like. I'm still very much processing Dead Reckoning Part 1. I really would like to see it again to fully formalize my thoughts, but this might be a movie where Part 2 recontextualizes where I ultimately land with Dead Reckoning Part 1. As I noted, though, I did like it. I do think this is a good film. I loved its tone. There's a sense of dread that is potently dire here. Really, for the first time, it felt as if no character outside of Ethan was safe. And the film goes out of its way to heighten those foreboding qualities. Tom Cruise is really great. This is arguably his best performance since Mission Impossible 3. So much of what he does here is internalized and is contemplative, and his sense of urgency couples extremely well with the film's shuddering tones. The stunt work is really great, as always. The action, set pieces, the choreography of it all, I do think is quite wonderful. There's the jumping off the cliff moment that they've been marketing to death, and it really is great. There's a train sequence at the end of this film that is exhilarating. Even the airport sequence, especially given that dire tone, I think is thrilling as well. I love the addition of Hayley Atwell. I don't always love the writing around her character. There are choices that she makes that are callous, and there's very little context to make sense of them. But on the whole, I do love how she's clever and a little rough around the edges, and Atwell's committed performance gives the character this affable charm despite Grace's ambiguities, and she has really great chemistry with Cruise. But speaking of the writing here, that is my biggest question at this point. And note that I use question because it's not necessarily a criticism. It might be, but at this point, the writing of this film, I have a few questions around its use of artificial intelligence. I don't know if it's vacuous or if it's alarmingly effective, because its godlike omniscience gives the film a palpable desperation, but it's also derivative, a little bit thin, so its postmodern ideas are a little broad and vapid. AI is really bad and dangerous in the wrong hands is about as far as this film goes thematically. But maybe that's because we're only halfway through this story. It's very likely that part 2 will explore those notions on AI further, thus recontextualizing again how vacuous this iteration of it is. As it stands right now, I think the film thinks it's smarter than it actually is. And that left a little to be desired for me. My other question is around character choices, especially with Ethan. Now, I'm strictly talking character progression, not his moral compass. I love how Ethan is forced to reckon with team unity and how that makes him emotionally vulnerable. That is really great here. But as it relates to Isla, for example, their pseudo-romance, I don't necessarily understand McQuarrie's thinking. The whole are they, aren't they thing is a little frustrating. And given what we saw in Fallout, there was an opportunity for this film to explore their relationship in a deeper way, and it simply refused to. In fact, Isla is hardly a part of this movie. When she is there, she's of course compelling. She's a great character in this franchise, but she is an afterthought in this film. which leads me to the Grace character, a character that at every turn was trying to subvert Ethan, despite the fact that without Ethan, she would have likely have been captured a couple of times over. He saves her life at least 2 or 3 times throughout the film. She's not a good driver, as we come to find out. She isn't going to defeat henchmen in a one-on-one fight. The film makes it very clear that she's clever, but she's not a trained spy. And yet, every time she undermines Ethan in some way, and I get that the film is trying to give Ethan some redemption based on these series of flashbacks that we see to his time before the IMF, but it's not enough to make sense of Ethan's incessant pursuit of her. What is it specifically about Grace that makes him feel a certain way toward her, especially when all she does is make him more vulnerable? And I'm talking about his emotional pursuit. I understand that Grace has one of the keys. So from a dramatic perspective, he is, of course, going after her, but that's not exclusively why he is drawn toward her. There's something else to it, and I don't think the screenplay makes that cogent enough. Whatever Ethan's life was before the IMF, it is obviously pivotal to his pursuit of Grace. But in this film, again, in a vacuum, on its own terms, it's a little too ambiguous, and as a result, it makes some of his choices a little baffling to me. Again, part 2 will likely make more sense of it, but from a writing perspective, it does feel a little thin and a little all over the place. That said, I do love Grace's turn after the bridge sequence, especially because of Atwell, her performance, and how she evokes this sense of wanting to belong. She does a great job of giving Grace this aura of loneliness. There's a really great moment in this film where she reacts to Ethan telling her that he considers her life more important than his, which she rebuttals with, well, you don't even know me. And that doesn't seem to affect Ethan at all. She becomes quite undone by his reaction to it. And I really loved Atwell there. I love Grace, love that turn. So despite how messy the writing can be at times in this film, Atwell gives credence to the emotional truth of Grace, and I did love it. Did love that quite a bit. So right now, that is my biggest question. Character choices, motivations, how these series of flashbacks tie in a vacuum for part 1, I don't think it all comes together cohesively. But this is a part 1. And part 2 will likely recontextualize a lot of what I'm talking about here and will remedy the questions that I do have. At least I am hoping that is the case. But that's what's keeping me right now from fully embracing this like many other critics have. My other small thing with this film is the visuals. I did love the action, as I noted earlier, the choreography, the thrilling nature of this film. I don't know if from a visual standpoint it's quite there comparatively to the rest in this series. I do believe they made a transition to digital here. Maybe that was purposeful with its notions on AI. I don't think that the visual nature of this film is quite as alluring, but that is a small thing in the grand scheme of it all because it's a Mission Impossible film and there's still a lot of fun to be had here. There's more humor to this film than I anticipated, and if I am going to perhaps lie to myself here a little bit, because I noted the visuals was really the only other thing for me, but I don't know if the slapsticky humor works either, but maybe that's because I was caught off guard by it. I didn't really expect it, especially given the really dire and tenacious tones that this film is going for in regards to artificial intelligence and what's at stake, the idea that none of these characters are safe. The slapsticky humor at times, I don't know if that gels well, but it could have just been how jarring it was that on a rewatch that might work more for me. So again, maybe that's more of a question than a criticism. The supporting characters here are really great. I've talked quite a bit about Ethan and Grace, but Ving Rhames is always wonderful in these films, perhaps the unsung hero He's really great here. Again, Luther has a wonderful moment with Ethan warning him about a certain character, and it's really great. Simon Pegg is really good here. That's where the humor always sticks for me with these films. Simon Pegg is great. Vanessa Kirby back once again. She's really good. Pom Klementieff, I think, is also great. I know there's some controversy surrounding this character, some of the stereotypes surrounding it. It's a silent performance, but I think there is substance to the silence, and perhaps that can be conflated a little bit. Not to take away from anyone that feels as if she's playing too much into stereotype. I understand that. But I think there is substance to the silent performance, to the internalization that many of these performances demonstrate throughout this film. So I think the cast here is really great. I think McQuarrie's direction here on the whole is good. I love the callbacks to Brian De Palma's first Mission Impossible. So at this point, I do think this is a good film. I'm maybe not quite as high on it as a lot of others are, but that's because I have questions. Again, it's not necessarily criticisms as much as I need to see part 2 before I can fully form my thoughts on part 1. And if these questions are left standing at the end of part 2, then I will ultimately come in pretty mixed on this film, given some of the writing here. But we'll wait and see. I don't want to necessarily hold to that because it is a part 1, and we know that we're only halfway through this story. So that's where I stand on Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. Let me know if you agree or disagree. Leave a comment below. You can hit us up on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram as well. We do have a podcast review of this up as well, where myself and Brendan Cassidy, we do go much deeper into this film and why we feel about it the way we do. There's a written review up on the website at InceptionFilm.com as well. Go and check it out. Man, despite my questions, I'm still very excited for part 2.